Welcome to you all and welcome to our esteemed panel. We've got a lot to get through today. I'm going to start with Professor Sophia Pandia, and I'm going to ask you to give us a bit of an overview of this idea of, to set the scene of the effect that Western populism is having in Muslim countries. You've got a particular interest in some of the, I guess, ones that have been newer to the discord or the debate, Bahrain, Yemen and the like. So set the scene for us as you can in where this is at. Where is populism and how is it impacting some of these Muslim countries?
Well, so unfortunately, we have the rise of populism in the United States, as all of you well know, as manifested with the electoral victory of, I don't want to call him my president, unfortunately he is, of Trump. But political science Larry Diamond points out that populism is rising globally. You have the rise of authoritarian regimes that rely on ethno-nationalism and tropes of purity and pollution. So we are the pure nation. We don't want these people that are coming in and invading our country. They're polluted. Also the trope of the idea that the nation is gendered as female. We need to protect our fragile state. So you also see the rise of authoritarianism and also hypermasculinity. So of course we see that in Turkey. You see that in the U.S. and the Philippines, Venezuela, Czech Republic, Austria, and many other places. Apparently, Larry Diamond argues that the rise began in 2006, which also corresponds with the decline of liberal and electoral democracies. And in many European states right now, especially after 9/11, even those states that previously would define themselves as tolerant and into pluralism are currently finding that they have limits to their pluralism, and they instead have been since 9/11 especially, and since it's become worse with the attacks on not just British soil but also European soil. They've been defining Islam and Muslims in quite reductive terms. Islam is an essentialist religion. Islam is equated with Sharia law and with terrorism. And so their very pluralism is not currently being extended to Muslims, in part because they framed Muslims as intolerant. They've decided Islam is an intolerant religion, so there's a paradox there. Their European and American pluralism is not always extended to Muslims because they have decided that Islam is not pluralistic, Islam is not tolerant. And I'll pass it on.
Paul Weller, Professor Paul Weller, what role are Muslim leaders in the West playing here, and I guess in Muslim countries, because that's an interesting part of this debate, is the populism within Muslim countries as well. How are these feeding off each other? How are they affecting the conversation?
Yes, I think this raises a question about the extent to which many reactions are reactive and defensive on the part of... Oh, it's disappointed. Come back again. Sorry. Yes, same phenomenon. On the part of those who are said to be Muslim leaders. Now, first of all, I think one's got to distinguish and break down what is meant by this terminology, Muslim leaders, because this can be understood in a number of ways. It can mean political leaders from within Muslim predominant societies. It can mean scholars and leaders within a religious sense. And often, unfortunately, particularly in the Western discourse, these things are mixed up and confused with one another. There is an Indian political scientist called Achin Banaik who has, I think, a very good statement that's worth reflecting on about this, about the relationship between religion and politics. It's pertinent both, I think, to the Muslim world and also to the Western world. And it goes like this, that something like this. People say that religion and politics should not mix, and at a time like this that's understandable. Now, that was meaning religion and politics as a state thing, as distinct from engagement in public life. He says, what one should be wary of is political leaders who use religion for instrumentalist ends, and religious leaders who use politics for narrowly communal gains. In other words, only engaging with the wider public sphere in order to secure one's own group interest. Now, I think there are sadly, among Muslim religious leaders, as also in different parts of the world among Christian and other religious leaders, those who interact with the wider public life precisely on that basis in order to secure the interest of one's own communal group, as distinct from engaging with the wider public life and tackling those things which face us as human beings in common, and engaging with those.
Professor Yilmaz, we talk about the Muslim world, but of course there is no one Muslim world, and we talk about, you know, when there's Islamophobic rhetoric, it's about, you know, Muslims, the Muslims, but there's no such thing as one Muslim voice and one Muslim issue. So talk us through the complications there, or the layers there, and how that is complicating, I guess, understanding and perhaps finding solutions.
I think it's related to our evolutionary development in the sense that we tend to, as humans, tend to simplify things and classify them as soon as possible. It is either a threat or not, so that I will survive. So we are all in these survival moods, even in Western liberal democracies. So it is always easy for us to define and classify groups, saying that Muslims, okay, put them in that box and they're dangerous, whatever. So it is always more difficult to deal and engage with these things in a sophisticated way and understand the complexities and so. So it's not only the Western public opinion leaders and politicians, it's the same thing for Muslim leaders as well. So they tend to see the world in terms of binary oppositions, us versus them. It's not only George Bush, many others have been doing this. And in the Muslim jurisprudence, there are also roots of this, Dar al-Harb, Dar al-Islam, but there are different variations, Dar al-Sulh, Dar al-Aman, and different classifications. But unfortunately, for political reasons, it's always been easier to simply simplify things and say that these Muslims are dangerous. And when you look at the media, when we talk about Islamophobia, we have to talk about the media, of course. You see that it is very natural. It's the nature of the media that you, in most of the time, need to talk about negative things, Barnaby Joyce, rather than the happily married couples, because nobody will be interested in reading their stories. They're just normal, ordinary. So they tend to focus on the Muslim Barnaby Joyces with the beards and the turbans, say crazy things and so on, even though they are less than 1% of Muslims. This is natural, but when it comes to Muslims, because of the hysteria, sometimes media organizations tend to be less responsible when it comes to a white guy in terms of political agility, in terms of skillful rhetoric and narrative and institutions. Maybe this is coupled with a few parameters. One is that the Muslims have been newcomers here compared to the UK. If you look at the British version, they've been there for a longer time. And also, a second thing is that compared to Europe and also the UK to a certain extent, Muslims here were not challenged much. They were not on the focus, and the atmosphere is, socio-political atmosphere, climate is much more tolerant, and the media was not too harsh, maybe until this riots, maybe, on them, and Pauline Hanson was busy with the Chinese at that time. So when you do not have threat, then you don't have the exercise. You are not immune against it. You don't work against it. Maybe this is one of the reasons. That's why. But it is changing, of course. There are different institutions such as AAS, that are involved in intercultural dialogue, interfaith dialogue, and so on. The only criticism that I could raise against the AAS is that sometimes, similar to many other interfaith and intercultural organizations, I mean the Jewish and Christian ones as well, generally speaking, they speak to the choir in their echo chambers. I mean, getting together with the like-minded people in most cases, and grassroots activity do not take place. It takes place, of course, but it can be improved. So rather than just only talking to politicians, I think it is better to talk to the people directly as well.
I'm going to get Professor Weller to weigh in on this, on the interfaith, multi-faith approaches. Do these kinds of organisations really make much of a difference? I mean, you hear about open mosque days and cultural festivals and these kinds of forums. Are they effective? How could they be more effective?
Yes, I think it's a very mixed picture. I think things like, Open Mosque Day is something that certainly is now nationally very much in place in the UK, and I think a very important thing because a large proportion of the general population may never have set foot inside a mosque, and incidentally there are a large proportion of Muslims who may never have set foot in a church, and actually setting foot in places that are unfamiliar to you is kind of disturbing. It's a little bit strange. You need somebody else to help explain it to you, and all these things I think are important aspects of the process of being open to learning and to development. Now, it's at one kind of level you could say, okay, well all that could go on, but people can still have terrible violence committed against them in the name of their religion or because they're X, Y or Z, and the political structures don't get affected by this. But I think it is important, precisely for what Issam was saying, that there are kind of grassroots things that are activities that do make a difference. So in the north of England, there was there's a group called Britain First, which is a kind of a semi-neo-fascist group demonstrating outside a mosque that was seeking permission to develop its buildings further. Well, they asked them in for tea. Come in, sit down and have a cup of tea with us. Essentially sort of English, of course, borrowed from elsewhere in the world, but actually it was incredibly disarming, and it actually worked in that context because these people who were aggressive were expecting an aggressive response, and it actually disarmed them. Now, that's one story. You could tell many other stories in a different direction. But I think those kind of initiatives are important. In terms of organised interfaith structure, again in the UK, there's been quite a long history of that, going back into the early 1960s, at a local level, often led, initiated by women, often very informal in nature. As time's gone on, some of these have solidified rather more into a kind of mediating body between religious groups and communities and the local authorities. So they become a kind of a forum within which that dialogue between governance structures and the faith groups can take place. Indeed, under the new Labour government, it invested quite heavily in the development of such fora, partly as a reaction to 7/7 and the events there, and almost, I use the phrase in some of my work, called forth these bodies, partly artificially. And there was a danger in that because they were funded externally, they were called forth for a political purpose. We need to know who we can talk to, yeah? So let's identify, and one can understand that because politicians do need to help with navigation in complex communities. But when you create these structures more artificially than some of them were in the 60s and 70s and early 80s in Britain, the danger then is when political agendas change, do they have the strength? So when the new Labour government went out and money was cut and no more money was put into these groups, some of them found they just didn't have the roots in the communities to sustain their own activities, and they kind of fell by the wayside. So And also then at the UK and national level, we have had a very interesting development. It can be criticised for lots of things. I used to work for it back in 1989 in its very early years, called the Interfaith Network for the UK. That's a kind of an umbrella organisation that connects representative bodies from within different faith traditions. These local interfaith groups, of which there are now well over 150 in different towns and cities in the UK, national interreligious organisations, and also educational bodies concerned not just with information about religions or historic study of religions, but educational bodies concerned with interaction between religions now. And that has been an important fora on a national level that's also had some credibility with government.
Professor Sophia Pandia, if populism is piling on Muslims, it's piling on Muslim women in an extraordinarily, I guess, in a much bigger fashion. This is something of your expertise. Tell us, why is it we're so obsessed with Muslim women and what they wear and what they don't wear, and if they're invisible, how is it that we're so concerned about their invisibility? I'm keen for your thoughts here.
Yeah, there's a weird sexual perversion about it. Yeah, so the desire to unwrap the Muslim woman and the fantasy that somehow underneath her wrappings she's wearing a belly dancing outfit and then will break out dancing, or that maybe she's held in a prison under the burqa. She's inside screaming, "Help! Please, Western people, liberate me, liberate me." So all of those contradict the reality of Muslim women's lives. So those that choose to cover, of course not all Muslim women do choose to cover, it's just an extra yard of fabric, right? In the West we really need to get over it. But I think that, so Gayatri Spivak talks about the pervasive trope of Western peoples wanting to rescue brown women from brown men. And you see that again and again, right? That the U.S. invaded Afghanistan to rescue women from the evil, rabid Afghani men. Same rhetoric in Iraq, same rhetoric, in many of the places in which the U.S. has invaded, unfortunately. So interestingly, in California, at my university, they held a Wear the Hijab Day. Like non-Muslim women wear the hijab in support of Muslim women. And so a few people did that, and I thought that was a nice thing to do. That's becoming increasingly popular across campuses. Because of Trump, or thanks to Trump, we have rising protectiveness amongst, especially the Democrats, for Muslim women, acknowledgement of the vulnerability of Muslim women. I have friends who have had their headscarves ripped off in California. California is a blue state, a liberal state, and yet they've had their headscarves ripped off their head. I've had students that, somebody has driven by them and they roll down their window and say, go back home, go back to where you're coming from. And they said, thanks, I'm going to be there in 5 minutes. There's a lot of misunderstanding about people that look different. One of the things I was thinking about when Paul was speaking is that another solution that we could think about, I'm not sure about the Australian context, but in the United States, we don't teach world religions at the high school level. Not everybody gets to the university. In the United States, only Catholic schools teach world religions at the high school level in a secular way. Religious studies or comparative religions or history of the world religions. I think we really need to do that. We need to teach difference. I also, just before I give up the mic, I wanted to say that, so you were talking about those that are, that carry out violence in the name of, those that carry out violence, if they're Muslim, they're always framed as a terrorist, and you were pointing out that in Norway, right, this gentleman was framed as Breivik framed as a ethno-nationalist. In the United States, a white terrorist is always framed as having mental illness. Okay?
I'm going to open it up to the audience now. Who's got some questions? And is there another microphone, or do I need to? Oh, very good, yes. So please put your hand up and put some questions to our esteemed panel. All right, while you're thinking about it, because I know somebody's thinking about it, you do have a question here? Fabulous.
Jump in on Sophia's point about teaching religion. The situation is much the same here as it is in the United States, as you describe it. For instance, a group like JCMA, the Jewish Christian Muslim Association, has a schools program. They go into schools and with one Jewish person, one Muslim, one Christian, talking about their backgrounds, etc. Very popular, especially in Jewish, Muslim and Catholic schools. State schools hardly touch it. If there is a suggestion to bring, first of all, there's a fear of introducing religion in secular schooling. But even if we had a program that enabled it, there's a lack of expertise in terms of teachers to be able to teach it. So there's no preparation. It would take a long time to bring something like that into reality. But it doesn't exist here very much either.
Just comment on that, because that certainly was the experience in the UK, where, against a background for a long history of teaching religion in primary and secondary schools. But around the 60s came the challenge: how do we engage? Because schools were the first place in society that really encounter the challenges of plurality. You know, ahead of other institutions, schools, young people coming into school. And it's a concrete and an existential question: how do we deal with these things? And what's the implication for the curriculum? And indeed, yes, it required a massive teacher training, in-service teacher training program in order to be able to equip people to shift from teaching predominantly about Christian religion, and sometimes not only about, which is another issue, but also to take account of other world faiths. One of the problems in the UK, where this is kind of well embedded, including what you might call a multi-faith curriculum, and indeed in the national curriculum you are required to both teach about Christianity as the kind of principal historically inherited religion, but also you are required to engage with other religious traditions, and including if you're in a government-funded confessional school as well. But one of the problems is the term religious education still hides quite a number of different practices and motivations. So in some schools, in reality, it still is forming people in a particular tradition. That may be legitimate, but it's one thing. Religious studies, in the sense that Sophia's talking about it, is another thing. And so part of the problem in public debate is sorting these two things out, one from the other, because otherwise people think they're talking about one thing, then actually they're talking about the other. And it's a common issue also in other countries. So, for example, in Germany, in the European setting, where the religious education takes place, but is in a very much more confessional mode. So it's there, but differently than this religious studies, or what we would call in the UK multi-faith approach to religious education.
I think Professor Sophia Pandit wants to say something here.
I do. So religion is on the front page of every newspaper every day, and I've long found it atrocious that not only are the humanities losing funding at the university level to STEM, do you use the same term, science, technology, engineering, and math departments, but also most religious studies departments are shrinking, losing funding, they're not getting new hires at the time in which we should be doing things like training teachers. Of course, you know, I have strong feelings about this. I think there's no justification for not teaching world religion at the high school level. You know, the idea that that teachers need training. Religious studies departments would be so delighted to provide the training. I think that Paul is correct in that there's long been a misunderstanding about what religious studies does. Religious studies is often conflated with theology. So, you know, I work for the state. The state does not let me proselytize. I cannot be the guru for my students. But I can talk about the politics of religion. I can talk about, you know, comparative religion. I can give my students, you know, basic facts about our world religions. And, you know, they're not teaching this. at the state level for high school students. Not everybody goes to the university. This is something we really need to do. And yet there's parent fear. There's fear that somehow teaching the world religions will convert our children to, away from Protestant Christianity, or, that's the dominant faith, or secular humanism, or whatever it is, right? But I think that living in a ever globalizing world, we need to know these basic facts about religion.
There's a question here at the front, the lady in the red scarf.
Hello, my name is Sarah. I'm a PhD student at Deakin University. My question is about the Muslim leaders, because you've asked about what's the role of Muslim leaders in terms of trying to enact policies or challenge political narratives. And I know that you're new still in Australia, but however, my question is, do you think that any kind of advocacy in that direction, in terms of challenging the political narrative, will be sufficient? And so far, I know that the ICV, the Islamic Council of Victoria, have already issued a couple of submissions with that regard, and they're very active in terms of challenging the discourse and questioning the media coverage and political rhetoric, and so they don't take it and shush. They actually talk back, and however their voices might be muted or ignored to some extent. So my question is that do you think that there is some kind of ignoring realm that surrounds them, or is it that they don't have enough, power or authority, or what is lacking them to act in a way that seems to be conducted by CARE in the US, because CARE seems to have more strength and courageous narrative whenever they talk about Islamophobia or issues related to Muslims.
I don't want to talk about the Australian context only, as I said, I'm not an expert on it. But by looking at the American, and especially since you mentioned the United States experience, CARE, and also the British one, it's true that they are in a minority. Muslims here less than 2%, so why would the politicians take them into account, whereas they have 20% Christians, 15%, whatever. So as being a minority, it has always challenges. So this is one of the challenges, and another challenge is the global one, that the Muslim image all over the world. Look at the media, and it's not just only fabrication of the media. Look at the Muslim leaders all over the world. Look at Turkish President Erdogan waging war against the West every day. These crusaders, Christians, Nazis, whatever, every day. In the Turkish media you hear about these things, and it's not just the Islamists in Turkey. Kemalists in the past were saying similar things, that the West wanted to invade our countries, they wanted to simply occupy Turkey, they want to create a Kurdistan, they are our enemies. And I remember when I was at an elementary school, we were singing songs saying that there are no friends of the Turks on earth other than the Turks. So, and Turkey is surrounded by enemies, so we've been brainwashed with this. And the Alevis in Turkey, who are not Sunnis, they are actually the puppets of the West, and the Kurds, same thing. The West has been trying to use them to wage, to divide Turkey into a few parts and so on. So if you look at Egypt, it's the same thing. So this, I would say, Muslim psyche, I mean, this is of course a very ideal type that includes sweeping generalization. So I'm not talking about every single Muslim here, of course, but generally speaking, this Muslim psyche that has inferiority complex against the Western hegemony, colonialism, imperialism, and Western successes, this is injured mind and conscience. So this feels that it is inferior. This has the complex, and the Muslim leaders all over the world, that includes Muslim minority leaders in the West, they've been using this psyche. They are the influence of this toxication, this poisonous attitudes. So it is always easier to use all these things and saying that, look, they hate us, they don't like us, and so on. So this is easy. You can easily use this one, and this is related to Muslim or Islamic populism as well. It is always used by politicians all over the world by Muslim leaders. And unfortunately, that includes Muslim leaders in the West as well.
I'll allow
Yeah.
Professor Corwell to come in on that one too.
Yeah, just
Got another couple of
mention
questions.
something about, for example, the Muslim Council of Britain, and one of the wise things they did, though they were criticised for it from within the broader community, is that they listened and learned from the Board of Deputies for British Jews, who'd been at this task for a longer time in the British context. So they were learning about how it's possible both to represent legitimately one's own community interests, but not only be perceived to be doing that, but also making inputs into wider public and political life, wider community concerns, cares and issues. And I think finding that balance is actually very important. So not rolling over and becoming lapdog kind of organisations that will just, oh yes, nice to see you, thank you very much, we're glad to get a pat on the head from the powers that be. That isn't helpful. But neither is only representing one's own interests and the injustices that are done and are indeed present for Muslim people in many parts of the world, but also having this wider agenda. And I think one of the things that again helps with that, certainly in the UK context, in comparison to some wider European context actually, is that very often in a number of other European countries, both for Muslims and for the wider societies, things are framed in a much more kind of bi-focused thing. You know, Muslims and Christians, or Muslims and the secular. Whereas, certainly in the UK, say compared to Germany, there's a lot more religious plurality. So there's a substantial Hindu community and Sikh community and Buddhist community, and they also have their part to play in public life. And Muslims have to find their place also with these others. And it's not reduced to the question of this much more bifurcated thing that one does find in a lot of other European countries.
We've got a gentleman with a question in front of you too.
My question is based on my personal experience in Australia. I have been here for 50 years now. And I was born in Egypt, I'm a Muslim. And I found out the problems that divide really Muslim from non-Muslims in Australia is not religious only, but cultural. I mix with many Muslim, I found they do not adopt to the culture of Australia. What do I mean by that? They know nothing about cricket, for example. They don't know anything about some of the Australian program on the ABC. They know very little. They know, I love the ABC, I watch it my number one station, thanks goodness for the ABC. They don't know about actors, songs, dances. But for me, I was educated at Cairo University. All my professors were taught in the West. I came here, I used to listen in Egypt to Elvis Presley, Shirley Bassey. I came here, and when I mix with my Australian friends, I can talk to them about things they love and things they listen to. So I was never discriminated against. And when I talk about Islam, they will listen to me. You know, and I taught at Australian Catholic University as a lecturer. I did my postgraduate education at Monash University. I taught at Monash, Australian Catholic University, Victoria University. And when I go there, my students will ask me, Adil Gaballa, this is very strange name. What this name? I said, it's an Egyptian Muslim name. What does it mean? I tell them what it means. And they said to me, you see, you tell us now, if all Muslims like you would like to know more about Islam, because I cared a lot about them. So really in religion, it is having to adopt the new culture and be aware of it and take it into our dealing with the society we are mixing with. But if we back away from it, it's very difficult to mix together.
There's a gentleman next to you in their glasses who's also.
Thank you.
Thank you for your comments there.
Just to follow up with the first question about educating children at school, teaching religious. I think the key problem we are facing these days is the media by itself. Like a recent statistic mentioned that at least Islam linked to terrorists mentioned 8 times a day. So unless we educate to be fair, some of our leaders in the Western country, do you see teaching religion at school will solve the problem unless the way of thinking of these some Western leader. I'm sorry to mention some name, but I have to, like Trump or Pauline Hanson here in Australia, if they don't change their way of thinking about other religion, about other culture, would educating kids only solve the problem?
So Trump's not going to change. You know, unfortunately, he's not going to change. I think that Ihsan Yilmaz was correct when he noted that some of our world leaders are not puppeteers, they're puppets. So unfortunately, the American people elected him, astonishingly. Shamefully. And so, you know, it's not Trump that has to change, it's the American people that have to change. I mean, we have to fight back populism. Populism leads ultimately to, you know, fascism if unchecked, and to violence. And so, you know, I don't think he's going to, it's not the leaders. We have to look at ourselves. So I think that's really important. And as for the question that you, or the comments that you, our first questioner made, I think you were talking about boundary drawing processes. And I think you were saying that it was easier for you to assimilate and make Australian friends because you had more fluid and flexible boundaries, and you were able to, you know, speak the language, and then we talk about cricket and Elvis Presley and so forth. But so the question for many Muslims is, to what degree are we going to assimilate? In the United States, some of the Muslim communities have a challenge right now because, so I went to the Women's March. You know, we had 2 of them so far, and of course I have like 3 pussy hats. And at the Women's March, you see a loud and large Muslim presence. I mean, they really showed up. And you also see a loud and large LGBTQI presence. They also really showed up. A lot of the vulnerable, you know, those vulnerable communities have gathered together, and you will see them at those venues. And the issue is, like, to what degree will the Muslim community accept, you know, like the gay LGBT community has fully accepted Muslims, and they are there to support them. And then you see some tension with the Muslim community. Okay, what are we going to do about this? Do we agree to be part of this new coalition? So it's a boundary drawing process, and it's complicated.
We have a question over here
Yeah,
as well.
thank you. My name is Parsu Sharma Little. I work for the Victoria Police, but I'm a community liaison. I'm also a refugee myself from Bhutan. My question is, I think one of you mentioned about the multiculturalism in Australia, and also in contrast to UK and then Europe. How do you put the narrative of Canadian multiculturalism and acceptance to rest of us in Australia and all the other parts in Europe? One. And in Australian context, do you think the Australian community or mainstream community has shifted the paradigm from perceiving multiculturalism is good food and good dance and culture only? Are we still in that bucket, or have we shifted from this bucket in Australia? And I think there's a lot in it here. Thanks so much.
Who would like to go first on that one? Firstly, I guess the idea of I've forgotten the first part of it. The Canadian, the Canadian, and I'm somewhat familiar with Canada, having met my husband there. So, and I do think multiculturalism and acceptance of other is really quite advanced in Canada. I think they're 30 years ahead of us because they didn't have a white Australia policy for starters. So, you know, at my level in broadcasting, there's a huge amount of diversity. You see a lot of faces from a lot of different countries in Canada, and that's just where it is, and we're not there yet, certainly in the media. So, who would like to anybody got a particular understanding of Canada who might want to?
I don't have a great understanding of Canada, but I've had a long-standing relationship with Université de Sherbrooke in Quebec. Has a centre around religion, culture and law. Done some common work with them, and what strikes me, I think, is that in Canada, both their constitutional framework and their legal framework has developed in such a way that it has undergirded what you might call the grand level multiculturalism, so that it hasn't been left to what we in Britain would call saris, samosas and bangles or whatever. That would be a way that's often characterised in Britain. I think you were implicitly criticising as, you know, that's, so let's all get together and share our food and then, you know, it'll all be okay. And you know, law is important in societies, certainly in societies that aspire to live by the rule of law. It's not to say that law is always right, because we know that law historically is embodied in justice as well. The US, and parts of the US, slavery embodied in the law, so it's not always right. But law is an important mediating thing by which people reach certain consensus agreements around acceptability, non-acceptability of things. In the UK, for example, ironically, you may or may not know this, but until the late 1980s coming into 1990s, it wasn't illegal to discriminate on grounds of religion or belief outside of Northern Ireland, which was a special case. And in Northern Ireland, it wasn't illegal to discriminate on grounds of ethnicity, but only on religion and belief. And in fact, I was commissioned by the UK Government Home Office in 1988 to 1990 to do the first empirical research project on the nature and extent of unfair treatment on the basis of religion. You know, there are real issues. Yes, it's possible on a personal level to overcome, to make connections, to communicate, but certainly in our research, I would say, and that our evidence, and we repeated it again 10 years later, you know, does show that some groups experience more unfair treatment than other groups when understood by reference to religion. These are real, hard, social, political, economic facts. And law can play an important role, not in making it all go away. You know, Martin Luther King, I think, to paraphrase him, and I probably got it wrong, Sophia will correct me, Martin Luther King Jr., you know, said about the law that it can't change people's hearts, but it can restrain the heartless, and at the very least. And it has a symbolic role as well, because it starts to change people's hearts, or at least the terms of the discussion. But it certainly can restrain the heartless, and that remains necessary in situations where hatred and manifesting itself into physical violence can actually happen on the grounds of religion or belief.
I'm going to throw probably what might be our last question to Professor Yilmaz. In, you know, with a new observation, I guess, of Australia, what are your thoughts on how idea? You know, we in Australia do rave about our great coffee, which came from the Italians, and we've got great Asian food, and we've got great Greek food, but have we done enough to really embrace, from your casual observation so far, in terms of, you know, we don't have a lot of ethnicity in our parliaments, we don't have a lot of diversity in our lobby groups, you know, we've got a pretty white bread kind of approach to life so far. Is this observation right, that basically the multiculturalism we celebrate is only about our food and dance and sort of pretending that we've got this great layer, but in fact we don't embrace at any political policy level? Putting you in the corner a little bit.
As far as I could see, I don't think that there is a conscious effort to simply exclude minorities or Muslims from the top levels, but if you are right, if you look at the top managements of universities, media organizations, not just only politicians, it is generally speaking Anglo-Celtic, white, and so on, but it takes time. So if you look at the minorities from Eastern Europe, Serbians, and also Southern Europe, Greeks, Italians, they are well embedded in society. You don't see them anymore. They are not visible. So, but 40, 50 years ago, I'm sure they were very visible. Catholics, now nobody is talking about Catholics, but they were actually puppets, fifth column of the Vatican 50, 60 years ago. So it will change, it takes time. And Muslims here, as I said, they are newcomers and their second, third generations are doing excellent things. AAS, for instance, it's been established by second, third generation Turkish Muslims here. They are doing terrific jobs, and so it will take time. Maybe my only criticism, again, I want to criticize all the time, so rather than lobbying politicians and so on and you asked about Muslim leaders, talking about Muslim issues all the time, maybe understanding that they are Australians first here. Maybe let's talk about poverty issues, Aboriginal issues, other problems, Australia's problems with China, and so not just defending whatever is happening in Palestine and talking against invasions in Iraq and Afghanistan. These are issues as well. These are not non-issues. Yes, one should talk about them as well. And sometimes Muslim leaders and Muslims are cornered that, okay, talk about this. Tell us why these Muslims are doing this. So this doesn't happen to Christians or Jews or Buddhists, so this happens, but we need to think and act outside of the box as Muslims, Muslim opinion leaders and so on, and just deal with daily life issues of poverty, homelessness, whatever. Maybe it might help as well.
Great, we have one last question just here.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that nice information. Really enjoyed it. My question will be to the entire panel. My name is Omar. I'm from Charles Sturt University. I'm a lecturer there. I teach theology in Islam. And my question would be this. Now, I can see that our topic today is on populism and how populism could lead to fascism. Maybe, they will produce dictators as well. And we're looking at, Muslims in the West as well, And we've been comparing and mentioning names like Donald Trump and others, who cause some issues for minorities as well. But when I look at the Muslim world as well today, and when I compare the leaders in the Muslim world to people like Donald Trump, like for example, if I compare Erdogan to Donald Trump, I would think that Donald Trump is like Mother Teresa next to Erdogan. Yes. Because when you look at Turkey, 60,000 people in prison, 17,000 women without any accusations, 700 babies are suffering in prisons in Turkey, people trying to get out of there, drowning, families drowning in, like in rivers and things. But why do you think this issue, I'll start with you if you like, this issue with the Muslim world and Muslim leaders, this populism is a greater issue, I believe.
Okay, so actually what happened in Turkey helped me understand what's happening in the United States. I started with Erdogan, trying to explain Erdogan, and then it helped me understand Trump. And sometimes I'm asked, do you think the United States will become as bad as what's happening in Turkey? So, this gentleman's statistics are correct. Some 17 to 20,000 women in jail, over 700 children are held with their mothers in jail, over 180 media outlets closed. It's pretty ghastly what's happening in Turkey, but one reason why it probably won't happen in the United States is because our founding document still preserves individual human rights, and in Turkey it doesn't.
It's only terrorist attack.
Right, well, but in Turkey, there's long been an emphasis on the state, on protecting the state at the expense of the individual, and I think that is that's a key problem in Turkey. Mr. Ihsan Yilmaz also referred to this idea that we're surrounded in Turkey. We're surrounded by enemies. There's there's deep paranoia in Turkey, and the fault lines run incredibly deep. There's also a long long pattern of people following a single leader, and often the leader is a strong man. And you don't follow two. You can't be fluid or flexible about that. You pick one and you follow that. You have a single identity. And so I find that is, again, at the Turkish level, there's a lot of factors that lead to the lifting up of Erdogan, and people are actually voting to give up their own power in Turkey. Yeah, populism is very interesting because you've got this growing willingness to support the person who reflects your values, and at the expense of having power yourself. You just support the person that reflects your values. But the problem is, soon people will find out that now this other group of people, they've lifted another guy up, and he doesn't reflect my values. But I don't have the law does not help. There's no way for me to get rid of him. I already gave up my power, gave up my electoral power.
Professor Paul Weller, and then we'll have
Let's go say something.
You talk about people giving up their power just because they like some person who shares their values. There is this Turkish joke about Turks. Angels knock on a Turk's door and says, look, blessings, we are sent by God and we'll give you whatever you want, but we will give your neighbor twice double the amount of whatever we are giving to you. Just tell us what you want. He thinks for a while and he says, just blind one of my eyes. So, unfortunately, rather than talking about your own interests, sometimes that's the Turkish paranoia about your neighbors, Kurds, Alevis, and so on. When I was a kid, I thought that Kurds had tails. Seriously. It wasn't because of my parents taught me, because they never talked about these issues, but just from the kids in the streets. And I grew up in Istanbul, in a metropolitan city, multicultural, whatever. And so that's the social culture. So if someone comes to me, like Erdogan said that, okay, I will simply exterminate these tailed humans, I will say, yes, go and do it. I don't want tailed humans around me. So this is unfortunately what's happening. And because of underdevelopment, it is related to education, unfortunately, one-sided education. You mentioned religious studies. In Turkey, religious studies means that you inculcate the values of Sunni Islam. You form their religious identity and teach them how to worship and so on. And Alevis, which is 10% of Turkish population, they're not Sunnis. They've been objecting, saying that, look, our religion is different. We don't want to get these courses. Turkish government saying that, no, this is constitutional. And this was actually put there by the secularist military generals. So it is not the Islamists. Why? Because of the Soviet invasion, they wanted this green belt, whatever. So they thought that teaching them religion would make them anti-communist. So it is very complicated. And people like Erdogan simply uses all these things by looking at the polls and looking what people love and like to talk about. Jewish people, conspiracy, Christian West, they are just puppets because they are ruled by the superior mind. Erdogan doesn't want to talk about the Jewish lobby because it is dangerous for him. He would be held accountable. So instead of saying Jewish lobby, he says that superior mind is behind the Gezi protest. Superior mind is behind the Gülen movement. Superior mind is behind the West. Superior mind is ruling the West, meaning that Jewish lobby, because people in Turkey love to talk about these issues. So it is related to grassroots socio-political culture. You said one man, for instance. It is in our blood, it is in our DNA, because we love to talk about one man. We love to talk about the prophets. They were all one single man. And generally speaking, we don't want to talk about the companions or apostles of one man, Messiah. And this is also partly related to religion as well. Look at Ottoman history. We never talk about the scholars, intellectuals, scientists, great statesmen, only Fatih the Conqueror. He went to Byzantines like them and just got Istanbul. Yes, we won. And so this is just a football match, and us versus them, and gaining, and yeah.
We have to wrap Professor. No, wait, we have to wrap it up. We have to wrap it up, please. Professor Willow, finish up. I'm sorry. We'll have a discussion afterwards if you want to head along.
I think the angel thing would have been a good place to start. So all I'm going to do is repeat the thing that I quoted a little earlier from that Indian political scientist, Ajit Bali. The danger is when politicians use religions for instrumentalist purposes, when religious leaders use politicians for narrowly communal gains.
Okay, I want to say that the biggest danger that we face with rising populism is scapegoating. In the United States, of course, the Muslim community, also Mexicans and women, everybody's been scapegoated. In Turkey, of course, you've got the Gülen Hizmet movement, Kurdish community, also Alevis. But the power that we have is not to be a bystander. We can't be bystanders for scapegoating.
Brilliant, that's a great way to answer. Thank you very much. I'm losing my reputation for being able to weigh in interviewees, but I think we had a fantastic discussion this afternoon. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts.